Why does it matter to Cornel West that he espouses a prophetic pragmatism? By prophet, Cornel West isn't referring to a soothsayer. He's referring to the heroic spiritual leaders embodied in scriptural texts that were attuned to the concrete sufferings in the lives of ordinary individuals. So why does it matter that he espouses a prophetic pragmatism? I think it's because a life lived according to a prophetic condition will have more successful results, both for personal and social transformation. Now, the life lived according to a prophetic tradition, I would argue, would include not only the reading of scriptures in solitude or living the tradition in isolation, but also recognizing that living the tradition requires looking at the various ways scripture has been interpreted in different cultures and in different historical epochs, including those of patriarchal cultures. Living according to a prophetic tradition would also include the functions of various churches in terms of their ministries. Looked at in this way, I would argue, is looking at a tradition as a lived practice. So it would include social ministry by churches in the form of sanctuary churches, churches as homes of refuge for homeless people. But the difference between a prophetic pragmatism and a secular pragmatism is that these narratives in the scriptures play a key role in self-examination, hence in personal self-transformation, and in communicating with other religious or non-religious believers in a way that speaks with candor and with passion. Okay, so I would like to compare a prophetic pragmatist worldview with a secular, in fact, a couple of secular pragmatic worldviews. Okay, here's the first. What's true is what works out, is successful in the long run with regard to serving human purposes and human interests. This is certainly the form of secular pragmatism that was described and promoted by John Dewey. In John Dewey's pragmatic vision of a socially transformed society, this would require individuals to examine and then change many of their habits as a basis for personal and social transformation. And it involves an attitude of experimentalism as far as what are the best solutions, looking for novel as opposed to merely traditional, customary solutions. For Dewey, this form of social transformation necessitates democracy, and a democracy in which there is social interaction among a variety of social groups and economic classes. Okay, here's another version of secular pragmatism. What's true is what the scientists, or using the scientific method, or other experts determine to be true in the long run. The idea of the long run was already envisioned by John Stuart Mill as the basis for truth. What emerges in the long run if dialogues among participants in a society are communicating in an atmosphere of freedom, in an open marketplace of ideas. It's similar to Jürgen Habermas's own idea about political, ethical, and legal truth, when he argues that consensus is the basis for ethical, political, and legal truth. But there are certain conditions which he describes in his theory of communicative action, the ideal dialogue conditions, and these require that the people involved in the dialogue, the society-wide dialogue have full information, can challenge other persons' need interpretations, that they've achieved their beliefs and need interpretations without coercion or manipulation, and that when the individuals that participate in a society-wide dialogue aiming at an ethical, social, political, or legal truth, that they engage in it with authentic need interpretations. In Cornel's pragmatism, based on Christian and Hebrew scriptures, given his claim that he isn't knowledgeable enough about other prophetic traditions, Cornel's pragmatism is similar to Dewey's, given his own recommendation, Dewey's, that given that life, nature, persons are constantly in flux, persons should reflect on whether one's habits are producing needed personal transformation, as opposed to being inimical to personal transformation. So Cornel's notion of truth as requiring input from Scripture is based on the idea that these heroic figures in Scripture, their courage, their self-sacrifice, their compassion, and their spiritual enlightenment are models of virtuous social action. In this attendance to the prophet's response to other suffering, that is comparable to Habermas's view that you're not going to achieve truth through consensus unless you're willing to accept as the most important basis for a policy those who have the most important needs to be met, or important needs as based on their interpretations. Okay, so for example, a Habermasian dialogue on a very divisive social issue in the U.S., the death penalty, would have to include the needs of capital offenders, their families, prison guards, in a face-to-face relationship with inmates, administrators, etc. Compare that with a cost-benefit analysis done by utilitarians, which would not integrate those face-to-face conversations as a basis for determining the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Check out what's going on in terms of the messages of superheroes in contemporary media. How much are they attuned, like the prophetic visionaries in the scriptures, to concrete instances of human suffering compared to a battle with abstract forces such as good and evil represented in one's enemies? Cornel West is concerned with the crisis of religion in America. What he determines is lacking is, among other things, its fervor. We can consider the importance of passion in his description in Race Matters of the vitality of Black churches in their heyday with respect to inspiring hope, providing comfort, and inspiring social justice. Now, of course, we've got fervor in many contemporary religious communities, such as evangelicals and cults, but he's talking about the messages delivered in more staid communities. And so the fervor and the passion is a better method for sustaining hope and faith, given that the messages are authentic and not ideological. So the church has been able to provide instances of powerful messages, not only in the discussion of the lives of heroic figures, but in their dramatic rituals, which include inspiring gospel music, for example, in the Black church. So in Race Matters, Cornel argues that the downturn in membership and attendance at Christian services and the solidarity involved in such membership in specific Black church communities must be included in any analysis of the current crisis in the African American population with regard to nihilism and materialism. So he thought the Black church in its heyday was invaluable to African Americans in their ability to serve as an antidote to American capitalism, materialism, and the nihilism that has resulted in the African American community. Although in that text, he does argue that the terms of the social contract between the Black church and the African American religious believers involved keeping one's sexuality out of the public realm, drinking, dancing, hooking up in bars. Another problem with the failure of contemporary American religion is the failure of a complex understanding, a complex and comprehensive understanding by the leaders of the social conditions affecting their society, though not necessarily the social classes of their members. He's concerned about the quality of moral action among religious believers. I would argue that one explanation of the diminution of moral personal action among religious believers is our tradition of American exceptionalism and individualism. Some religious believers are exceptionalists, believing that their faith precludes certain disasters from facing them, and it entitles them to privileges not available to non-believers. Now, the question to me is, aren't American religious leaders addressing in their messages the moral quality of the members of their community's daily lives with regard to Cornel's issues with materialism, instant gratification, random nows, selfishness? Or is it their message is falling on deaf ears, given the contradictions between that message and American culture? He also claims that the American or the typical American religious experience is shot through with emptiness and the lack of spiritual depth. One way to logically support this position is to consider the possibility that religious leaders don't want to offend capitalist members. There's scriptural support for the various churches not being willing to upend the status quo, which is a tremendous gap between the wealthiest and the poorest. For example, the principle, render unto Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and to God that which is God's. Okay, so although churches may be asking for contributions to mission causes both at home and abroad, it may not be appealing to capitalist owners and managers to have compassion for the underpaid working poor. Is his support of this claim about the moral actions of American religious believers, is his support the low level of activism rather than the quality of their personal lives? When the American study of philosophy of religion became more grounded in issues of social and institutional conditions underlying American religion, and less with logical proofs of the existence of God, American pragmatists, he argues, discussed American religion in an intersubjectivist turn, not merely a focus on a religious believer's internal mental states and their relationship to truth. So while Cornel West argues that all American or most American philosophers were evading philosophy, with philosophy being understood as concerned with theories of truth, and theories of truth understood as based on the correspondence between one's mental representations, one's ideas, beliefs, and external reality. American pragmatists' discussion of the value of American religion were concerned primarily about their espousal of communal values, social injustice, their response to social injustice, and the verification procedures of church leaders. One possible implication of this phenomenon that American philosophers, including philosophers of religion, were evading epistemology is that the message that got communicated in the religious services would be more concerned with social transformation through outreach programs and through personal transformation, and not much of a discussion of the truth value, for example, of miracles. Now, Cornel West espouses many Marxist ideas, but he's not a reductionist. He doesn't believe that every aspect of culture, including religious and moral beliefs, is an outgrowth or emanation of the ruling economic classes or interests. He acknowledges the importance of the message of liberation theologians, which was primarily about the church's need to ameliorate the misery of the masses. So he doesn't believe that the requirements of capitalism prevent this from occurring. But he does claim that the respects in which capitalist thinking has led to a decline in morality, personal and social, hasn't been sufficiently addressed or resolved by contemporary Christian churches. He also thinks that the writings of liberation theologians, with some exceptions, lacked sufficient philosophical vigor. So in his supporting prophetic pragmatism, it's on the grounds that to achieve social justice, we need heroic, courageous, morally developed leaders with a genuine, authentic moral vision who are attuned to the concrete lives of ordinary individuals in suffering. Of course, a good example, his exemplar would be, of course, Martin Luther King. But he thinks that American philosophers of religion are a good example of doing philosophy because now, currently, it includes cultural criticism. So if an American pragmatist, secular pragmatist, is proposing a solution to an issue of American concern like environmental degradation, that pragmatists would need to consider the ways in which the solution must include a cultural transformation, given our present consciousness and values of consumerism, materialism, individualism, and exceptionalism. His examples of successful theologians include Elizabeth Fiorenza's writings regarding the patriarchal Christian tradition, and to a lesser extent, the validity of Mary Daly's arguments in her criticism of Christianity as misogynistic, patriarchal, and necrophiliac, given the worship of dying prophets, corpses, example Jesus on the cross. Contemporary philosophers of religion also provide important historical and social analyses in order to determine which religious norms uphold economic elites or uphold the capitalist norms. A good example would be the Protestant work ethic, which presupposes that salvation involves the hard work of believers. And of course, Nietzsche's analysis of the consequences of Christian values on relationships of power, in particular relationships of oppression. How poverty as a Christian value may uphold social injustice, how obedience could contribute to oppression, and how one interpretation of the Christian virtue of meekness could be viewed as antithetical to courageous opposition and provocation. West also argues that prophetic pragmatism should include not only narratives about the past that are heterogeneous, a variety of different heroic figures, but also heterogeneous narratives about the future, possibly a future that's not based on the consequences of the second coming of Christ, the apocalypse, or the reunion with souls in eternity. These are my examples, of course. So, possibly most importantly, social and cultural pragmatic solutions must be moderated by a moral vision, whether it's secular or religious. For example, let's look at the moral visionary, Martin Luther King, in his I've Got a Dream speech. He acknowledged that his grandparents' generations would never have dreamed it were possible to have a society in the U.S. of race equality. Yet, that dream, in some of its elements, has been validated. Or let's take the example of just war theory. Christian writers, I would argue, originated that just war theory, the element of just war theory, but now has wide acceptance by secular theorists. And also, he thinks that these pragmatic solutions for a better future should include the input of our significant moral norms, whether they're derived from our religious leaders, our secular leaders, our philosophers, regarding things such as the good life. We could look at Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to basic human rights as an example of Aristotle's eudaimonia, or notions of sociality that involve a conception like Aquinas' common good as a basis for social policy, as opposed to cost-benefit analysis and utilitarianism, or significant moral and secular norms regarding our lives, examples of intimacy, personal intimacy. We've got the American constitutional law regarding the right to privacy, in which sexual intimacy was viewed both as essential to the bonding of married people with children and essential to an individual's self-identity as validated through a significant intimate relationship. In conclusion, I would claim that Cornel West's idea of a pragmatic prophetic solution needs to include the message embodied in the lives of the prophets and the practices embodied in the Christian tradition, given that these messages have been invaluable in providing hope, principles, and values leading to successful forms of social and personal transformation.